The National Beer Wholesalers Association produced this short video to help explain trade practice laws. We hope this video can help give the beer distribution industry a better understanding of the background and reasoning that governs trade practice laws for the sale of beer. A problem with a national video on trade practices is the United States is set up with 50 different alcohol markets, not one national market. Each state regulates alcohol differently, and any discussion on trade practices must also examine state trade practice law for beer. This video will only discuss the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, also known as the FAAA. Recently, TTB produced videos that go into detail on the FAAA, and we encourage you to review them as well. As always, if you have any questions about the FAAA, contact NBWA. If you have any questions about state law, contact your state association. Many of your states have wonderful resources to explain state-specific trade practice laws. So, why can't we sell beer like we sell bottled water or potato chips? Why are there even trade practice laws for alcohol? Where did these laws come from, and do they even work? From the days of the Mayflower, through the first excise tax on whiskey, to the decision to amend the U.S. Constitution twice, alcohol debates have always been controversial. While a majority of Americans drink, polling from the Center for Alcohol Policy shows that a similar number of Americans are very concerned about problems caused by the misuse of alcohol. In present day, the Centers for Disease Control estimates that 88,000 people die a year from alcohol-related causes. Our country has always had a love-hate relationship with alcohol. In the late 1800s and 1900s, our country's debate about banning alcohol influenced every national, state, and local election in some form. In 1919, this love-hate relationship manifested itself with the passage of the 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol. A significant factor to why even alcohol drinkers voted to ban the sale of alcohol and pass the 18th Amendment was the alcohol industry's many abuses at the time. In those days, alcohol suppliers owned the retailer through a series of exclusivity contracts. These tied houses were loyal to one supplier and often engaged in troublesome business practices that raised many societal concerns. These tied houses were known as the saloon and were blamed for many social and family disorders. These businesses promoted overconsumption and attracted other vices, such as prostitution, gambling, and other crimes. As a result, the saloon was identified as the bad guy, and the Anti-Saloon League was created and rallied the entire nation behind the very popular idea of getting rid of alcohol to eliminate the saloon in an effective way to help pass the 18th Amendment. However, the nation soon realized that banning alcohol was an ineffective solution. The evil saloon was replaced with a just as evil speakeasy or corrupt government officers. Increasingly, people realized that prohibition brought about by the 18th Amendment was a failure, but at the same time there was considerable fear of bringing back the old saloon. John D. Rockefeller Jr. commissioned a historic study on how alcohol is regulated around the world and how alcohol should be regulated if it was legalized again. Toward Liquor Control set out the principles of how to regulate a formerly prohibited product and prevent the return of the tied house. The Center for Alcohol Policy has republished this book, and any beer distribution employee interested in learning more about the background of today's laws is encouraged to read it. Toward Liquor Control gave us many of the alcohol policies in place today, such as the need for state-run liquor stores for hard alcohol, the need for higher regulation for hard liquor, lighter regulation for light beer, and the license system. However, for our purposes today, it is most relevant for its efforts to prevent the saloon from coming back by eliminating the tied house. Shortly after Toward Liquor Control was published, the country ratified the 21st Amendment to repeal the 18th Amendment, but it also passed Section 2 of the 21st Amendment, which gives states the primary responsibility to regulate alcohol. As a result of Section 2, there are 50 different state alcohol markets. Each market is purposely different from neighboring states. President Roosevelt issued a statement when the 21st Amendment passed, asking the states to prohibit the return of the saloon in its old form or some new modern guise. Congress and the states got to work on creating systems to prevent the tied house from returning. The states tinkered and experimented and eventually ended up with a 3-tiered distribution system we know and operate under today. Congress passed the main piece of federal regulation of alcohol, the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, FAAA, in 1935. Again, this video will only discuss federal law and not various state trade practice laws. FAAA sets up the federal overlay on alcohol industry regulation. The FAAA regulates the alcohol industry by requiring permits for importers, wineries, distilleries, and wholesalers. It sets up a series of labeling, advertising, and trade practice laws tied to the permit. Failure to follow these laws risks the loss of a federal permit. The federal government uses permits to restrict what upper-tier industry members can do to lower tiers. Today, the law is enforced by the Treasury Department's Alcohol and Tax Bureau, TTB. And the trade practice laws are working. American consumers have more choices of beer than consumers in any country. A brewery in one part of the country can be on the store shelves across the country immediately due to independent distribution and independent retail, as well as the trade practice laws that make that situation possible. Other products and industries that you see at retailers operate under different rules. For example, in other categories, there's a heavy use of slotting fees. Slotting fees are prohibited in the alcohol business. While potato chips may buy their shelf space, distributors need to work with retailers to fill shelf space with high-velocity beer purchases based on market research and service. The FAAA is not perfect. There are some serious holes in the law. The FAAA does not license retailers, so they do not have a permit with the TTB, which could be revoked. That could put wholesalers in a position of saying no to retail customers if that is something that violates the FAAA. This is harder when big retailers such as Walmart are much larger than wholesalers and brewers. Brewers do not have to get a federal basic permit. In 1935, Congress considered brewers local businesses and therefore rejected an attempt to have them get a federal permit. Today, there are 10,000 breweries, including some giant corporations. This loophole creates extra pressure on beer distributors since TTB can only enforce a violation against a beer wholesaler permit holder, not a brewer. It can put wholesalers in a tough position if a retailer and a brewer are asking for things in a beer transaction that a wholesaler cannot do due to federal and state practice laws. The TTB is the enforcer of the law, but they have not always been consistent with their enforcement. This has resulted in some confusion in the marketplace. Today, the TTB is more actively enforcing the laws, and that is creating additional concern. We encourage you to watch the TTB videos explaining the specifics of federal trade practices to help you better understand the inner workings of the law. So that was a brief overview of the history of alcohol regulation and the origin of trade practices. Remember that the goal of this nation for alcohol regulation after Prohibition was to prevent the tied house from returning in the old form of the saloon or any new form, so any effort to give aid to the retailer should be viewed cautiously. I encourage you to examine the TTB videos on exclusive outlet, tied houses, commercial bribery, and consignment sales. A beer distributor must have an active permit from the TTB to operate as a beer wholesaler. This permit can be revoked or suspended for failure to comply with the FAAA. As such, compliance with trade practice laws is a top priority for all NBWA members. Thank you for listening, and please contact the National Beer Wholesalers Association if you have any questions.